Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming back. We're now on to our next panel of the day, this time discussing the future of conservatism after the European elections. As most of you have probably noticed, there were European elections to the European Parliament earlier in the year, before the summer, that saw something of a sea change in the composition of the European Parliament, where yet in another example of a sort of populist conservative wave washing across the continent, the establishment political parties once again were forced backwards. The European People's Party, the conventional centre-right party, remained in first place. In second place, you had a reduced socialist and democrat grouping. But then perhaps uniquely, we saw the emergence of a new third force in the European Parliament, the so-called Patriots for Europe, a grouping that comprises of conservative and populist forces. And then not far behind them, you find the European Conservative and Reformist family, which made considerable gains, with 50 newly elected MEPs arriving back in Brussels and Strasbourg this week. This has shown a complete change in the way that European politics is taking place. We've seen the emergence of a new sort of conservative coalition appearing across the continent, bringing in forces that weren't previously considered to be conservative. So whilst the traditional left has declined in rural and working class areas around the continent, we've seen the emergence of new conservative forces to replace them. Hopefully with our panel we'll discuss in more detail and explore this idea and perhaps try to understand what happened during the European elections and what it means for a conservative Europe going forward. So perhaps I'll hand over to Hélène Fantini first to give her remarks.
Thank you very much. So yes, my remit was to be part of a panel to explore the impact of the recent European elections and a chance to reflect on the direction of the conservative movement and how the various groups will interact with each other. So the European elections were really about two Europes, just as regional and national elections continue to be about two Germanys, two Austrias, two or more Frances, and so on. So I'll leave it to others or to all of you who are certainly abreast of the news to talk about statistics and numbers and votes. And instead, I'm going to talk about what I think these elections mean. And instead of speaking about how the various groups will interact with one another, I will say how I think they should interact with one another. So I'll begin with an observation. As I said, there are two Europes. The conservative movement, if there's one that can be easily defined, which sounds like we had a precursor to that discussion in the previous panel, represents one Europe. And the entrenched establishment, the managerial elites, the deep state, represents the other. So when I say the conservative movement represents one Europe, I don't mean one Europe, I mean one kind of Europe, where the entrenched elites represent another Europe. So what exactly do I mean by this? I wrote an op-ed for the European Conservative right after, the day after the elections, entitled, "Don't Compromise with the Mushy Middle." And in that, I argued that the elections are supposed to be a reflection of the will of the people who live and work in Europe. Individuals expressing their opinions and saying what kind of Europe they want. And overwhelmingly, it should be clear by now, the people of Europe are looking and were looking for a significant change. So Europeans are fed up with open borders and the insecurity that it's brought. This message is apparent in the successes of the Alternative for Deutschland, Rassemblement National, the Austrian Freedom Party, Fidesz, Fratelli d'Italia, and many others. Additionally, the overwhelming vote against green parties across Europe has sent a powerful message. People have had enough of absurd net zero policies, and instead they want politicians who will protect our farmers from the stranglehold of the EU regulations that hurt them. Voters don't want policies that will force us to buy expensive electric cars or to eat bugs or to make us freeze all winter. They don't want that. And so the challenge for the European right, the conservative movement, having clearly been given a mandate by voters, as Rob says, this populist nationalist wave that crashed on the shores of Brussels. The challenge is to make sure these newly elected or re-elected politicians on the right have their feet held to the fire so that they don't make compromises with the mushy middle, the centrists. And this has happened too often in the past. So if the elections indicate a real shift, people looking for something different, for real leadership, in some countries, this is taking the form of hardline, anti-immigration government party. In others, it's the fresh face of an anti-globalist, anti-woke party. To be sure, there were some surprises and some setbacks for parties on the right, and many should take stock of where they went wrong. I hope they do. But what's clear is that they should already be planning for the future so that they're ready next time. Any party that believes in national sovereignty, strong borders, subsidiarity, and who seeks to protect children from the trans and woke agenda, doesn't worship at the altar of net zero, ought to turn its back on the center and work together with the right-wing groups of the European Parliament. So this has, of course, been made much harder by the immediate erection of the cordon sanitaire, immediately built up around the national conservative sovereigntist forces in the Patriots for Europe and the Europe for Sovereign Nations groups. So this exclusionary practice already saw these two groups denied any top positions in the parliament, despite one of them, the Patriots for Europe, being the third largest bloc in Brussels. Conservatives should not participate in the shunning of democratically elected colleagues. So think about it. This term, this cordon sanitaire, was meant to create a barrier to stop infectious disease, a dividing line between a healthy population and an infected one. So Ursula von der Leyen and Eurocrats like her, they're treating their democratically elected colleagues as if they have the plague, a communicable disease. And of course, once you erect that wall, they'll have no say in any policies. But what does this really mean? Is this gamesmanship? Is this Brussels shuffling and reshuffling? No. What it means is that the millions and millions of Europeans who voted for a change in Brussels will have no say over what happens in Europe. So, many Europeans, understandably, take very little interest in the game of musical chairs in Brussels, who gets what seat, who's on what committee, who gets to be a commissioner, who's executive vice president, who is junior vice president. Ordinary Europeans don't care about that stuff. And that's very challenging, frankly, for someone who runs the news division of a publication called the European Conservative, where we have an office in Brussels and we are reporting on Ursula von der Leyen's gender parity demands are not being met and who's going to be on what committee. Ordinary Europeans don't actually care. That's the truth. What they care about is that the parties and positions they voted for, the promises that were made to them, are being ignored by the very top, by erecting this wall around the patriots, the sovereigntists. What Ursula von der Leyen and the Eurocrats are saying is, it doesn't matter what you voted for or who you voted for. You don't matter. You don't matter to us. And if we didn't make that obvious the last time we were in power, we'll do it again. So the cordon sanitaire is not just thrown around these groups, these political groupings, or even around individual MEPs. It's been imposed on the millions they represent who demanded a real change in the European elections. So there will be plenty of newcomers to Brussels who won't play by the establishment's rules. They should be encouraged, rewarded, and supported. It is their rejection of the status quo that gives us all hope and which reflects the dissatisfaction of citizens across Europe. So conservatives in Europe should stand up for their colleagues. By doing so, they're standing up for ordinary Europeans. The elections told us, and continue to tell us in countries that have regional and national elections, that voters are not going to stay silent anymore. They don't want to hear empty promises from ambitious politicos anymore. They don't want to be told one thing only to see precisely the opposite happen in the halls of power. They want to change, and we're seeing that. So the European right will have to hold the establishment accountable. What does that mean? It means anyone who calls himself conservative must be held accountable. I think of the so-called center-right politicians who call themselves conservatives when it's convenient. They should be called out every single time they support a policy or a position that isn't conservative. They shouldn't be called the center-right if there's nothing right-wing about their policies. You know, we allow these narratives, these labels, to be applied when they're not relevant. So if you have this spectrum, right, between the far left and the far right and something in between, the center seems like it's supposed to be reasonable. Who wouldn't want to be part of something reasonable in the center and, well, the center right? But because everything in politics and policies has gone so far to the radical left, positions that were normal, that ordinary people think are normal, are now called far right. So consider what it means when somebody is called center right. If they are going to describe themselves as center right, make them prove that they deserve right in that moniker. So anyone who's called center right or calls himself conservative needs to prove it. They should be called out every time they support a policy or position that isn't conservative, as I said, or any time they begin to waver in the face of any criticism or opposition. And just a note there, we've been saying, we meaning sort of my crew, my team, we keep on talking about these narratives that come up and how I think very good-willed people are very quick to disavow the fringes of the right, right? This is a challenging terrain. Remember that the left never, ever disavows its fringes. Never. They won't. While on the right, people get very nervous about fringes. And I think it's fine for a person who doesn't agree with those fringes to ignore those fringes. Don't give them airtime, but stop punching to the right. Stop punching to the right. We don't need to give our opponents more help in beating up the right wing. Just ignore the fringes. But we need to stop punching to the right. Conservatives in Europe should not be fooled by centrists who only now back away from radical and unproductive green policies. No conservative in Europe should celebrate a party or a politician who, in what is clearly too little too late, starts talking tough on migration, only in the face of an impending electoral defeat. The left and the progressives, the radicals, the socialists are very good at working together. They overlook large chasms of difference to achieve common goals. And much of this was alluded to near the end of the previous panel. But I think conservatives need to take a page from their playbook. Understand that we may not always agree, and sometimes policy differences are pretty big. National interests can be very, very different. Strategies can be very different. But if we find the common ground and respect that ordinary Europeans want their voices heard, then we have to work together. So, ordinary Europeans know what they voted for. Conservatives in power should not let them down. Thank you.
Before coming on to the elections, I want to suggest what is actually the political system operating in modern Europe at the present time. A number of political scientists have tried to do this, particularly when they're trying to explain the battle is between populism on the one hand and liberal democracy on the other. I'm going to mention two. Professor Moutet, Cas Moutet, a distinguished Dutch political theorist, I think he's now in Florida, but he gave one definition of populism, which I think is a correct one. He said populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Populism is a democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. I think it's fairly clear, and you can see what it means. Another such definition was unintentionally revealed by Professor Papas, a Greek political scientist who was for a while working in Washington, who both of these quotes come from articles in the Journal of Democracy, which is put out by the National Endowment for Democracy and is in general favorable to the idea, hostile to populism and favorable to its definition of liberal democracy. But unintentionally, Papas said something good here. Populist parties embrace democracy, but not liberalism. Well, fair. Arguable, but fair. But the second sentence, but then he went on to say, liberalism without democracy is not a combination found in real-life polities today. Well, that is very interesting, because liberalism without democracy is an apt description of the system of government towards which Europe and the West have been moving since 1989, and populism is the resistance to that movement. However we juggle things, the main choice facing the voters seems likely to be between some sort of democratic populism and some form of liberal, or in less descriptive language, some form of progressive elitism. And that's not formally the choice in many countries at present, but it is a choice towards which post-industrial voters and countries seem to be tending, as we saw when we've looked at the fates of the left and right around the world. Perhaps because of the extraordinary phenomenon of Macron, who was elected actually by populist methods and appeals, combining right and left, denouncing the regime of the parties, and so on. And as people, in a sense, look at these things more and more, obviously very clever people come to some interesting conclusions. I want to particularly celebrate here the insight of Pierre Manon, who was, I think he may still be, Director of Studies at the École des Hautes Politiques and Sciences in Paris. In an article originally from a French magazine, but appearing in the magazine American Affairs, he argues that populism is likely to be absorbed into a new party system, but in a negative way and even in a destructive way. He sees this new system emerging ultimately from the conversion of both major traditional parties of left and right, in France especially, but elsewhere too, to the European idea from the 1970s onwards. In becoming, quote, European, unquote, and modern, in quotes too, the left abandoned its original constituency of the working class. In making the same transition, the right, the Gaullists in France, in making the same transition, the right abandons its constituency of the nation. Those of their respective voters who continued to feel loyal to these particularisms and the loyalties arising from them became an embarrassment to the new model parties and an obstacle to the parties that the European idea demands and demanded. Those policies were a set of rules for harmonizing the EU's economic arrangements, its political commitments, and even its national come democratic character. They were determined by small and often semi-secret committees of bureaucrats in Brussels, and once determined, these objectives were not really subject to amendment or repeal by national parties responding to the democratic objections of their electorates. If all this sounds a little abstract, the brutal treatment of Greece in 2014, I think, by the EU Troika, which overrode its democratic choices by fiat, will make the point. The future of Europe is determined in a political stratosphere and handed down to nations and classes which are required to endorse it. As it comes, endorse it as it comes. Those who object, clinging to class or nation as their primary loyalties, have therefore to be seen and slandered by their own traditional parties, the left and the right parties, as various kinds of deplorables, extremists, populists, unrespectables, and even sometimes, in cases genuine hysteria, terrorists. Some of these deplorables break away and found new parties representing their old loyalties. Others cross the political spectrum to join parties that now seem more sympathetic to them. And when these defections occur, the leaderships of the mainstream, now the centre, now joined in the centre and in grand coalitions, begin to see their own common interests more clearly. I recommend Pierre Manon's essay unreservedly. It's a rich and complex one. It was written a couple of years ago, but it's really still telling the truth of today. If these trends continue unchanged, Manon thinks, I would argue it's already obvious, actually, that they will lead to a competition between an unrespectable national populism and an arrogant cosmopolitan centrism, or in his exact words, I love this, between populist demagogy and the fanaticism of the centre. And it is notable that if you look at debates between these two groups in European politics, the language used about the centre, about the extremes, is much more vicious and unrestrained, savage, and I would say slanderous, than that used by the populists towards the centre. We already see the bare bones of this new system in the European Parliament, and they've been confirmed in the last, I would say, I'll come by the elections. We've already seen this in the European Parliament, where mainstream parties of left and right now form a coalition against the extremes, that is, all the other parties. They do so in defense of European integration, globalization, supranationalism, overlapping jurisdictions, more or less open borders, extreme individualism, and cosmopolitan values, and against xenophobia, national sovereignty, respect for traditional culture, any communitarian sense of belonging, and democratic patriotism. If you look at your own countries, I think you will see the lineaments of that kind of system thriving there. It's not hard to see this list of issues, in this list of issues, an emerging competition of class interests corresponding to David Goodhart's two broad new groups of any worse and some worse, and I would say also the recent book, Values, Voters, and Virtues, by Matt Goodman, I think, who sees politics now as a battle between an elitist coalition of fundamentally social revolutionary elites, and on the other hand, a corresponding populist coalition of voters of right and left against it. Fundamentally, traditional voters versus social revolutionary visionaries. Macron's earlier victories in France, though achieved through populist methods, was a victory for this emerging centrist consensus in which Manon sees great dangers. Let me cite two in particular dangers. The political system that Manon foresees would replace an earlier system of left versus right, in which the battle was over how to share the economic spoils. That system would be replaced by one in which the battle is over such questions as immigration control, gay marriage, the civil rights of religion, multiculturalism, the dilution of citizenship, the transfer of sovereignty to authorities outside the nation, and the loss of any sense of democratic ownership of political decisions. Battles over how to share wealth and income streams are much easier to settle than disputes over morality, ethnicity, citizenship, and allegiance, which, as we see in the US too, can be toxic. Second, in the old left versus right world, both sides essentially accepted the legitimacy of the other. They did not do so by saying vive la différence, but as Manon points out, by acknowledging that the other side would win elections occasionally, and when they did, they had the right to govern the country for a specified period. Manon observes, I think rightly, that the centrist establishment consensus in Europe does not really, as you were just arguing, Ellen, does not really accept the right of the extremes to come to power. When they do, it thinks it legitimate to use supranational legal and political powers to constrain and even to oust them. One, see the cases of Hungary, Poland, and Austria, and the imposition of refugee quotas on reluctant member states. See also some of the reasoning and emotion behind the self-dramatizing resistance, in quotes, to Donald Trump. What Manon's new party system offers, therefore, is a much more partisan and bitter battle over questions that are more difficult to solve and more resistant to compromise than the world in which we all grew up. And contrary to bien-pensant progressive opinion, populist demagogy is much less to blame for the bitterness and intractability of this political battleground than is the fanaticism of the center. Nonetheless, it's important to realize, and Manon does, that these new political loyalties will not simply replace the older ones wholesale, as if a new page of history had already been turned. In some cases, where the national political tradition is a revolutionary one, such a complete transformation of the parties might occur. In the main, however, this new political division will infiltrate the existing parties and gradually change their characters, leaving them not completely, but substantially unchanged. And that's why we're in a transitional period to this new party system, and why it's a difficult time for the ordinary voters to understand why it is they feel uneasy about their traditional party, and why it is they also feel uneasy about voting for a new political party, which everybody else is saying is monstrous and extreme. Now, I haven't said much about the election so far. And I'm going to leave it for questions, really, because what I have to say is really quite simple. They echo what Ellen has already says. The idea of a cordon sanitaire is, which says that the voters, that the people elected by substantial numbers of voters, I'm not talking about the guys who get a tiny number of seats in odd places, that's a different matter, but the idea that the leaders of a few parties can decide that the opinions of the voters who elect other parties substantially should not be considered or allowed to change policy is absolutely monstrous. Furthermore, it's something from which the right, in the broadest sense, has suffered badly from in Europe since 1945. It is not accepted by the left that the two totalitarians who imposed their rule on large parts of Europe between 1933, well, actually between 1917 and 1945. The left does not accept that they are comparable. It does not believe that the regimes which sustained undemocratic governments in power in Central and Eastern Europe until 1989, it does not accept that they are to be treated with the same kind of reserve as the people who allegedly, implausibly very often, are sympathetic to the neo-fascism of the right. That had meant, for example, that has introduced into European politics then, and it's remained to the present, a bias towards the left, in which you get parties like the Greek parties which actually refuse to condemn the Gulag when it came before the European Parliament. They are not treated as doing something monstrous, although, of course, if I suppose it might just possibly be the Golden Dawn might endorse Nazism, but I don't even know that that's true. But certainly, maybe Daniel will tell us, but there is a kind of, I would say, a reluctant consensus that somehow or other the right has got to be treated with greater reserve than the left, even when the right has not been supporting undemocratic regimes, let alone crimes against humanity, and the left has been doing so. The Italian communists had greater respectability across Europe than for example, well, I could cite a number of European cases, but the most interesting, of course, is the case where eventually the prohibition collapsed. The Mussolini-esque party, I think it was the MS Italian Social Movement, that got about 6% of the vote year after year. It was never allowed to be in a coalition. Then it was taken over by a man described to me by a good liberal, Antonio Martino. He described Fini as the cleverest man he had ever met in politics. And in Italian politics, that is high praise. And Fini took the irresponsibly right party, MSI, he turned it into a Thatcherite party, which probably, Daniel, you've dealt with them at times. No, never? Well, he turned it into respect. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, he turned them into a respectable party, and Fini himself became deputy to the leader of the the former French president Giscard d'Estaing, when they were putting together the European Constitution. So he achieved as much respectability as you can in Italian politics. And the Fini party, the National Alliance, became a member of a democratic government. And that continued the case until he made the grave mistake of thinking he could replace Berlusconi, and he fell like Lucifer. So, oops, never mind. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I've been talking extempore too long. I have to get back to the theme. And the theme is, if you look at the recent elections, the European elections, they fundamentally continued the previous trend of 2014 and 2019. That is to say, the right advanced. It didn't advance as far as people were expecting or people were hoping, but it did advance. It consolidated the gains of the two previous elections. If you look at the left, if you look at the mainstream parties, with the exception of the German CDU, they have been losing ground consistently as well, right and left. The left has not been, the left has been gaining some ground on the extremes like Mélenchon's party in France. But the fundamental change of the shrinkage of the mainstream parties, because they no longer satisfy their voters, continued. The improvement in the populist right parties, and a kind of mixed result on the far left, they continued. There are the most interesting elections One was Denmark. The press said, look, the Danes have stood up against the populist tide. Had they really? If you look what had happened, the Danes the Danish parties had all adopted the policy of controlling immigration, and they control it more strictly than any other country. And as a left wing, I mean, the only common sense you could find about this was a left-wing magazine in Denmark said, this is fundamentally not the defeat of the right, it's the absorption by the right of everyone else on their key policies. That's one example. But where we get interesting, I think, is the European Parliament. What the politics that I was describing above have accomplished is the failure electorally of the mainstream parties has forced them to form grand coalitions wherever they would otherwise lose power. And those grand coalitions have been, the number of votes they could call on have been shrinking, and the people at both extremes, the other parties, have been growing. Now, some of the results for the mainstream right have been disastrous. The last federal election in Germany, the CDU, which is the only party I think that's ever got above 50% under Adenauer, that shrank to 20%. That is an astounding implosion. Of course, it's more than equaled by the collapse of the Social Democrats. Now the governing party, one of the main governing party, but nonetheless, in the most recent elections, getting 6% of the vote, the ones we saw the other day. So, as this has happened, so the two major mainstream parties, left and right, have had to bring in other moderates. The Greens, not moderate in any way, the policies are extreme that the Greens are forcing on the rest of their coalition partners, and they're leading to further losses for the centre group. The other group would be the Liberals, who, given a bit of a boost in the past by President Macron, have added to their numbers. But the fact is, that centre group is now close to losing its majority. It won't lose it. It didn't lose it this time, and it may not lose it next time, but it will come very close to doing so, and it may actually do so. Now, what's the weak link in this depressing situation? In other words, jolly good weak link. Well, it's simple. I don't myself see how the German CDU, which is the heart and soul of the EPP, and which explains and which, in a sense, with other people, with other Christian Democrats, has ensured that insurgent parties of the right, like Fidesz, have been expelled from the EPP. I don't see how the CDU is going to persist with its current policy when everybody can see from the results recently in Eastern Germany and the results of the last federal election that their own voters do not like what they're being given. Secondly, what they were being given was Merkelism or a rehash of Merkelism. But that is the dying creed in the CDU. Friedrich Merz, its new leader, is moving slowly, in my view. That's what friends in the CDU tell me, to change policy. Most recently, of course, he essentially said that he supported the end, he didn't put it in this dramatic way, but he supported the effective end of Schengen in the sense that the Germans have got to impose border controls because they're living in a world in which terrorists cannot be allowed to cross borders and in which migration policy cannot be completely indifferent to the social problems it brings about in these societies. And there is, I think, in all of Western Europe, there is a movement in this direction. Now, there are other policies and there are other problems which we can deal with in questions. But for the moment, it seems to me what you have in European politics is the CDU would lose some parties, and again, Daniel knows much more about this than I do at that level, if it were to make a deal with the ECR and the other conservative bloc, and they would have a substantial majority. In Germany, that would be the basis of, and it probably will be the basis of an election next year in which the right resumes power. I think that, frankly, if I were Merz, and of course, the Germans will be glad I'm not, but if I were Merz, I would be saying things like, well, Mr. Orban, we haven't agreed with him on everything, but he's plainly a democratically elected leader. He's won 3 elections after the one which brought him to power. He's won any number of other elections locally and so on. Clearly, there's a serious opposition to him as well. In fact, the interesting result in Hungary was you now have, as a result of the terrible government we have, you now have a result in which its principal party, under this new the husband of a former Orban minister, is offering what I would call Orbanism without Orban. And it's a member of the EPP. And that means these two parties now, these two conservative parties, will now dominate Hungary for the foreseeable future. And what happened to the left? I think they got 7% in the election, something like that. So don't believe that everything is going to hell in a handbasket. It is, but you will get out. It's not hell; it's purgatory, because you're going to get out the other side. And the only way this won't happen is well, there are lots of different kinds of follies politicians can commit, but if they keep their heads and they devise intelligent, serious policies to deal with the social problems that we've all been discussing, and I believe the ECR parties actually do fit that description, then I think we're moving towards a better and a more soundly based, intelligent politics. Thank you.
So let me throw one phrase out there, which was coined by a friend of ours at the International Republican Institute, Thibaut Mozergues, who came up with this notion of post-populism, this idea that parties formerly described as national populist or conservative populist find their way back towards what might be considered the middle. But in reality, what's happening is that they shift the debate so much that the center moves. And I think one of the things that both of you have addressed about this election is the very clear idea that the so-called center ground in the European Parliament has shifted. That's the Overton window has moved slightly to the right. And that you find that even amongst EPP members, the members returned from traditionally center-right parties in countries like Spain and Germany are presenting a much more right-wing position, in part as a reaction to losing voters to populist parties in the past.
Yeah.
But that may be true. But as long as they participate in this cordon sanitaire, they don't deserve any credibility, because what they're doing is co-opting the populist policies without the democracy part. And, I have a bone to pick with the CDU, because I remember what Vienna, Austria was like before 2015 and 2016, because that's where I live. And when I watched waves after waves of men, young men, going through the Vienna Central Station on their way to Germany, there were signs. Going to Germany, they would write Merkel and an arrow so that people got on the right train. Well, guess what? A lot of those people didn't get on the train to Germany, and Austria is a different place because of it. So this idea that the CDU is waking up, I'm sorry, but it is a glacial pace. If they're waking up now and saying, gosh, what have we done to our country? Have we, in fact, as moderates, sacrificed our daughters, our mothers, our sisters on the altar of multiculturalism, and now we're waking up and saying, gosh, maybe it's not a great idea to do that. So, I'm sorry, but at least in Denmark, the parties all agreed to stop sacrificing their daughters on the altar of multiculturalism. They're not Johnny-come-latelys. I mean, German moderates have no business patting themselves on the backs for realizing that migration might be a problem. And then this post-populism concept. Sorry, I'm getting all my notes done at once. So post-populism, I mean, guys, populism hasn't even really had a chance to do anything yet because they keep being kicked out of the room, dirty tricks, having elections maybe even stolen from them, or in Brussels, quick, let's change the treaties. Let's change the European treaties to make sure that populist forces don't have any power. Let's contort all of the rules to make sure the populists don't have any power. And then, even better, well, let's just talk about post-populism so we can just, brush that. Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to see here. When millions and millions of Europeans have said, why don't we just pause here with populism for a few minutes and see if we can change anything? But the entrenched elites, who we keep on calling moderates, won't even give them a chance to participate, to say anything in a debate, to table any legislation, nothing. So, I would say populism's demise should perhaps be delayed until it gets to live a bit.
But I don't think that's what post-populism means, actually.
Well,
at least it's not what the definition not the description I would give of it. I would say, first of all, that the centre in Europe, particularly the European Parliament, has not simply moved slightly to the right, it has shrunk. It's smaller than it used to be, and it's probably going to get smaller. Secondly, I agree, of course, about the failure of mainstream parties to deal effectively with some of the most important problems, particularly mass immigration and the imposition of multiculturalism. In the case of the Germans, of course, they came to the wrong policies fairly late compared to other countries. I mean, they had the Turks there, but it was 2015, I think, that Merkel invited the whole world to come, and that has produced very dramatic changes quickly, particularly, and very quickly, because I think it was almost the following year that in the Cologne case, in Cologne railway station, in which about a large number of young women were sexually assaulted, and the first response of the authorities and of the establishment was to try to deny it and downplay it. That they can't do that anymore. But what do we want as a result of this? Obviously, I criticize people I disagree with. Yeah, fine. But I actually want to persuade them in the end to come over to my side. And I think what I want to see is the reunification of the respectable right. I want to unite the right. I saw that happen in Canada, where Stephen Harper, who's now head of the International Democratic Union, which all the centre-right parties belong to, I saw Stephen Harper first divide the right and then reunited, essentially moving it rightwards at the same time, and after which it took time. If you divide the right, which we've done, notably in Britain in the last election, you're going to be outside, you're going to lose power for more than one election in all likelihood. But the thing, because it takes time to reunite parties that have been stabbing each other in the back, front, and side. And what you need to do is to get over that period as quickly as possible. How to do it? Well, I'm not an expert in that. I'm not a politician myself. But I certainly think we want to bring the right-wing parties together because we want to not only win power, but we want to win power for long enough to be able to change the society in a better direction. And so reuniting the right, I think, should be one of the policy aims, Robert, of the New Directions Conference institution and the ECR as a corporate body. I would hand over to the people who actually are actually down in the battleground fighting up to their knees in mud and so on. So But I think that's what our strategic aim must be.
I think let's open up now to questions from Dan.
Thank you very much. I thought that was really interesting from both of you. Ellen, you'll be amused that the cordon sanitaire goes back a very long way. And when I was an ECR MEP, there was what I always thought was a very funny example of it, which is that for important positions, the European Parliament always used to nominate a Christian Democrat, a Liberal, and a Social Democrat. You know, for the TTIP talks, for the European Constitution, it was always the top three groups. Until ECR became the third biggest group, pushing the Liberals into fourth. And then suddenly it became somebody from each of the two big groups and a third person from another party agreed by those two, right? I mean, it was the blatancy of the thing and the insult to our intelligence that was funny rather than the cordon sanitaire. And I think the point you both made about the changed circumstances that have driven the rise of AfD and so on, it's, you know, when a far-right party wins in Germany, the headlines write themselves, don't they? And the headlines have been the same all over the world, including in Germany. I think actually there is arguably a parallel with the rise of Hitlerism, but it's one that very few commentators have made. I've never believed that the rise of the Nazis was to do with, I don't think there was much popular biological anti-Semitism. I mean, okay, there was a bit of anger about foreign policy, but when does a foreign policy ever really dictate an election? It was overwhelmingly about disorder. That the most disciplined and orderly country in Europe had collapsed into street violence, parliamentary brawls, political assassinations. And by 1930, people were so sick of it that they were prepared to vote for anyone who would put a stop to it, even if those people had been involved in creating the disorder in the first place. I don't think you can begin to appreciate what's happened in Germany without looking at the crime figures. We see the headline, you know, the shots fired at the Israeli consulate in Munich, the copper murdered in Mannheim, the day before the election, or the week before the election, those three murders in Solingen. But there's actually just a quotidian rise in crime rates in schools, on trains, and so on, which is never mentioned in polite society, but without which I think it is impossible to understand the appeal of these parties. Anyway, what I really wanted to do was to ask John something. It is natural for us to exaggerate the wrongs done to our side by the other side, and not so much to downplay as just not to see equivalent behavior from our own allies. But I wonder how fair it is to say that the moderate centrist parties are uniquely bellicose in their language. You specifically talked about some of the extra democratic moves against Donald Trump, and we can all agree with that, the judicial moves against him. But shouldn't we apply the same test both ways? I mean, no force on earth would get me to vote for Kamala Harris, but I suspect that if she lost, she would at least accept the fact of her defeat and concede. Can anyone in this room say the same with confidence about Donald Trump? Isn't there just a general rise of all or nothing elevation of outcome over process? You know, the language that has been normalized from our side. Knock the crap out of them, you know, stand by and stand down, you know, we need to fight, you know, and to me, being a conservative is partly about valuing civility and temperance and cool-headedness and prudence. I think these are actually just very bad times to be a conservative because of the rise in angry language and angry deeds on all sides. And I think that getting the diagnosis right is critical because something has changed in the last 10 years. I don't know if it's the belated response to the financial crisis or if it's to do with migration. I personally actually rather agree with Jonathan Haidt. I think it's about smartphones. I think we're in an age where a lot of people have been rendered gullible and impatient and angry by social media. But something has happened which I think makes traditional politics much harder to maintain, and this is not limited to either side of the aisle.
I don't think it's limited to either side of the aisle. I was talking specifically, of course, in response to the describing the what I think is largely the truth of Manon's description of politics as populist demagogy. So demagogy is there in the phrase versus the fanaticism of the centre. And I happen to think, if you look at the way French politics, but also wider European politics has developed, the extremes have been actually, Mélenchon is pretty, he speaks pretty angrily. But I think most of the, well, take reform in England. It's been responsible in what it's said. It hasn't gone over into certainly anything like, demands for violence. And I think the same is true of for a long time now, of the national, well, now the National Rally. And of course, the best example, maybe particularly directed at you, Daniel, would be George Maloney, whose heroes are Chesterton and Roger Scruton. And the Italian right has for a very long time been highly responsible, I think. Now, obviously, everybody goes, F.E. Smith said in, I think, 1919, "You want revolution? We'll give you revolution. We'll slit your soft white throats for you." Now, I don't think that Galloper Smith was generally given to that kind of thing, but the revolutionary atmosphere in the Clyde and elsewhere was quite strong at the time, and so people are led into folly of that kind. But look, I think somebody who can tell me more about French politics than I could tell her has just arrived.
Actually, we should let Lorenzo tell us about Italian politics, because I think what you were both describing, this tendency of parties to become more mainstream, it has a word in Italian. It's called trasformismo. It's the way radical parties become mainstream. Isn't that right?
It's true.
Hello, and first of all, I apologise. Late train, late taxi, late everything, my fault.
So perhaps we'll jump straight to you, actually.
Honestly, let me take my coat off.
Yes. Actually,
Maybe Daniel would just finish his remarks.
Yeah.
I don't think he had done. Yeah.
Well, no, I had pretty much finished. I just think that I think we have, if we see ourselves as conservatives rather than as revolutionary rightists, if we see ourselves as valuing Burkean inheritance, I think there is a duty to invigilate our own side with particular diligence, right? And the fact that the other side doesn't, exactly as you were saying, doesn't do that, doesn't get us off the hook. I think we still have to do that.
I would agree, of course. Yeah.
Well, I'll push back because I guess I'm the provocateur here. So I think that is, of course, the conservative ideal, but the impulse to say, you know what, we've been polite too long, and look at what has happened to our countries, is understandable. I mean, look. In Germany, there's a website called Messer in Incidents. And what is it? It's a guy who, as a hobby, because he was so alarmed, uses AI to troll through police reports every day, and he puts a knife on a map of Germany, every time there's a police-involved knife incident in Germany. And I check it all the time. So 82 since last Monday, 82. And then think about it in the UK. So Hugh Edwards, BBC presenter, is going to get no jail time for the possession of really shocking and horrific child pornography images. I used to be a criminal prosecutor who prosecuted child pornography crimes, so I'm familiar with how horrible they can be. Your imagination can't tell you how horrible they can be. I could. No jail time, but people, ordinary people who got really, really angry, really, in fact, blind with rage about the fact that a bunch of little girls at a Taylor Swift dance party were murdered, and tweeted angrily, or even acted angrily, probably beyond the pale even, jail time for them. So it's these kind of
forgive me, Ellen, but that's an exact example of the difference between a conservative and a conservative, it seems to me, should be in favour of jail time for anyone who attacks a policeman, sets fire to a building, or incites a crowd.
I don't think
the
a
number of people on our
conservative
side who were doing exactly what you just did and saying, yeah, but it's understandable, of course they were angry, blah, blah, blah. Not justifying, but contextualizing. I think that's incredibly dangerous because we of all people should be the people who stand for laws being general, equal, and certain and predictable.
I don't think any conservative should be in favor of jail time for anybody saying something and not acting on it. I mean, I think that's very dangerous. But in any case, we can debate that over a glass of wine. And now the late Anne-Elisabeth Moutet.
I have no idea how I jump into this, because what I did say was I would talk about the mess that is the political scene in my country, and it's a bit far away from knife crime, and probably it's too far away from knife crime because they managed to ignore it extremely well. And we have arguments. I was waiting in various places since this morning, and I could see sort of people sort of rising, saying, no, you can't send people to prison, it's overcrowded, it's horrible, you can't do this to them, and it gives no results. And I don't know how they know, because they look like they haven't tried for years. But I used to live in New York, and I lived in New York in the 80s and 90s, and I could tell you that zero tolerance policies work. I remember being taught by my family in New York that you don't go past 96th Street. You do not, when you go out, you always have a $20 bill in an easy-to-reach pocket, so that a mugger, you can give it to a mugger, and usually he will go and score a hit and won't take the rest of your stuff. You don't cross the park at night. Sometimes you don't cross the park at day. And it was a dangerous city. It's getting dangerous again. It's not to that level yet, but it is getting dangerous again. And then came Rudy Giuliani, who hired the police chief of Los Angeles, William Bratton. William Bratton had very strong points of view about policing a city. He was also aware that it takes relatively few people to create the kind of insecurity in which crime breeds like bacteria. And he was learning from the James Q. Wilson theory of the broken window theory. The broken window theory, I bet most of you know it, is the idea that if you give to a community the sense that they are being left aside, which is what's happening in my country in most of what are called difficult neighborhoods. A graffiti, a broken window, a place that's left to ruin. It can just be a bus stop with graffiti on it. And slowly you create an atmosphere in which anything goes, and then you create crime. So it's not as if this hasn't been known for some time, but whenever I raise the notion, I write for a newspaper in England, and I'm on television in France, and whenever I raise this, I'm told that this is a reactionary theory. And I say, but it was, it was used, tested, put into action, and it worked because I lived through it. And of course, these were horrible people, because Rudy Giuliani was a horrible person, and therefore the level of denial and the fact that you can immediately sort of say, this person is a fascist, this person is stupid, this person is both, most of the time both, they don't want to take it. I do not know how we change that. I have no idea how we change that. I know that women, but not all women, are much more aware of this, because there are areas in Paris where I really will not take the Express metro, for instance. I can take the Elizabeth line, the wonderful new Elizabeth line in London at any time of day or night. I'm not worried. But I am worried in Paris, in the wonderful infrastructure that we got 40 years ago, and which now really sort of suffers from broken window theme. This is not in the mainstream debate in my country. The mainstream debate now is, we have, you probably know what happened to France. We held European elections. The European elections gave an extremely good score to the National Rally of Marine Le Pen. She got a clear majority of voters, and she got 100, and she got a group of MPs in the European Parliament that was bigger than most of the groups of the other French parties, and everybody was horrified. And instead of saying, right, this is a poll, it's writing on the wall, we paid for this poll in a different way than we do, we didn't get it from an institute, Emmanuel Macron looked at that and said, this is an insult to me personally, and he called a snap election, which he didn't have to do, and we had a general election in which, in the first round, the results of the European election, which is proportional representation, came exactly in the same way to the candidates in every constituency in France. We have 577 seats in the National Assembly. So everybody said, the fascists are coming, we have to fight them, and it created an unholy alliance of the extreme left, the normal left, the centrists, and the wishy-washy right. I can't think of any other way to call them. And they managed to block the way of National Rally candidates who had come first in the first round. We have 2 rounds in France, with the result that when the dust settled after the second round, the National Rally had 143 MPs in the French National Assembly. The coalition, the unholy coalition of the right, because you've got a party of people who think that Israel should not exist and that France is guilty of crimes against humanity and colonialism. And they have extremely violent demonstrations in which you don't have a single French flag, but you have Palestine flags. And they allied themselves with the remnants of Léon Blum's old Socialist Party and some centrist, center-left people, and the 3.5 communists that hold their rallies in a phone booth, and the Greens. The Greens are a very interesting sort of phenomenon in all our societies, and I would like, it's easy to call them watermelons because they're red inside and green outside, but they prey on public opinion, especially young people, because they terrorize them. And having terrorized them, they join extremist opinions on everything else into their fight for climate change. I'm not against fighting climate change. I'm not against ways of trying to make the system work better, the place be less polluted. But it is very obvious that these people are not motivated solely by that. It's the vehicle in which they transmit into our political life extremist opinions that match the Melanchonista, the extreme left party I described before. So the alliance of these people, who hate one another, by the way, won 193 MPs, and the Macronistas were lagging behind with 120, but they would have had 45. So Emmanuel Macron, the man who wrote this extraordinary situation, was looking at all of this thinking, I have not lost. By any count, he had lost, but that's all right. He had lost less than he might have lost. Yeah. We now have a system in which nobody trusts politics anymore. We've got the tail wagging the dog, which is the extremist left part of what they have dared to call the New Popular Front, which is an evocation of Léon Blum's Popular Front, and frankly, it is insulting. But anyway, they have 79 MPs, and therefore they have 13% of the National Assembly, but they're the ones who shout louder. They're the ones who said, we have a prime minister and you must name that prime minister. And the others are so terrified for various reasons, but mostly because when they had the incredible horse trading between the 2 rounds in order to get candidates, before the first round and then between the 2 rounds with candidates, the socialists, the new branch of the socialists who just came out with a bright, new, clever young man who is wet behind the ears called Raphael Glucksmann, they do not know how you negotiate seats and how you make this work for you. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon is 73, and he knows he's been in Parliament, in the Senate, in many places for a very long time. He knows exactly how to do that. His career started under François Mitterrand, who knew how to do that. And therefore, they agreed to give seats to the socialists, to the Greens, to others. But these were not seats where there would be a majority for the socialists anyway, and where, people who did not want the National Rally in power would vote for anyone with the standard label. No, they gave them France Insoumise, France Unbowed, their own party, places where they had a majority. Because that way, if they say boo, they say, right, I will run somebody against you next time, and they are killed. And that's, again, politics is something we should not despise. Politics is something that we should know. We should know the coalface. We should know the details, because that's the way you get killed. What they are is Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks, as their name does not say, were actually a minority in Russian politics. And they were a minority when Bela Kun tried to take power in Hungary. And they were a minority in other places. So we've got actually a situation which is dangerous, because whenever something happens that Mélenchon doesn't like, the great conductor or leader or duce of that thing, he says people in the street, and they have demonstrations of young people who are violent, waving the Palestinian flags and burning stuff. What are conservatives to do? French conservatives are basically like, they're staring at the boa constrictor, and they do not know what to do. They are told that being a conservative is bad. The National Rally, we were told at every level that we had to vote for anyone from the Republican front, because the National Rally was essentially the return of Pétainisme. The National Rally have been canny, but the thing about the National Rally is they have no experience, and Macron, again, a man who makes so many mistakes in understanding French society, he does understand his own interest. He called a snap election, but he called a snap election. And when I say snap, he said, we're doing this in 3 weeks' time, and you have 1 week you have 3 weeks to prepare everything, and then you'll have 1 week to digest what happened in the first round and do something else. And so he sped up everything like those Laurel and Hardy movies of a long time ago, and everybody went running around. And the Bolsheviks, of course, I mean, they know how to organize things, because this is how you take power. The National Rally were hopeless on this one. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't have candidates, because they didn't think that they would win elections, and they never realized that it doesn't matter. One day you will win elections. You must organize your candidates a long time ahead. You must brief them. You must also check on them. You must be careful. It didn't work. Didn't really. I mean, the nice, shiny young man, clever young man, but very young, who Marine Le Pen found to head the party, they didn't know how to do that, but they did not have time. And whenever they want to have a new cadre of advisors that will make them become normal politicians, the new cadre of advisors are basically old-fashioned French right-wing people, and it never came to them, the idea to take, to bring in Linton Crosby. First of all, they don't speak English. They don't know, we are desperately sort of old-fashioned in that. So we've got conservatives who, having come first in the European elections and in the first round of the national elections, of people who were outraged by exactly what Ellen has described, the political result of this is nil. No effect whatsoever. They are not part of of political life, and Marine Le Pen is looking at this, and she says, I mean, we polled 100 million votes, and the left got 7 million votes, and Macron got 6.7. And next time we'll win, and next time is the presidential election, and she will run for president again. And she thinks that from 11 she will go to 13, but that's not true. That's not true, because she doesn't own all those votes. There are people who believe that it might work, and they saw that they really blew it. I'm not saying that they were lured into a trap. They were lured into a trap, but that's life. And they will not have the 13 votes. There are people who will think it's not worth it. Yeah, I mean, these people are incompetent, and it's no worth doing it. And so what I've sort of vaguely sort of alluded to, more than described, is a sort of a landscape in France was completely disheartening. And when I say that Michel Barnier, the 73-year-old former Brexit negotiator who started politics under General de Gaulle, is probably the best prime minister we could have, this is not something I say with massive enthusiasm. It is something just, oh, what the hell. But he is now, the left have decided that they will not participate in this government, because yes, they were quite willing to ally themselves to anyone, including the Barnier people, to bar the road to the National Rally, but to actually sort of govern the country and make laws, no, they're not going to. And so there's going to be a government of Républicains, which is really the party that scores not much. We are essentially in a lunar landscape. We also, we do not speak foreign languages. We do not talk to foreign conservatives. I don't know if there's anybody French in here. Il y a des Français? Nope, and I am not surprised because I go to as many conservative conferences as I can because it's nice to meet people and see how different they are. And the French don't. The French are not, as the Germans would say, salonfähig, because we don't speak many languages. And when we speak it well, it happens from time to time, it's Macron, and Macron speaks French in excellent English, but it's French. It's French things that he thinks about. It's French. It's everything sort of, it's like doing a sort of a Latin translation, you know, when you're basically, you know, you're in the 21st century, and I'm here are all the words, and I will turn this into Latin. I have no idea whether a Roman would understand anything to it, and that's Emmanuel Macron speaking English. But we don't realize that there are ways, at least, of making people excited by ideas. Most of our conservatives, not all, but most of our conservatives are looking back, and depending on how far right they are, they look further and further back, because we've got a small nucleus of royalists. We have people who are horrified that the French Revolution treated the church horribly. There are people who do not like laïcité, and laïcité is a French way of dealing with a lot of nasty things like encroaching Islamism, and each country should do conservative in their own way. Like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families, and the French are an unhappy family. But we should also know what the others do, and we should also look forward. And unfortunately, we are not clubbable, we're not going outside, and we rehash all ideas. And as I said, I think Marine Le Pen may have whisked out Jordan Bardella, who's 29. I think he just turned 30. I mean, and he's beautiful, and he dresses well, and he takes great selfies, and he does not think in any other terms than terms that would be perfectly recognizable to Charles Maurras in 1920. So this is our landscape. It is deeply disheartening, and I hope you're having more fun in your countries.
So I think we're drawing to the end, so I'll sort of I'll take the position and ask whether the panel agrees that, if, in effect, these European elections were the elections in which the European public decided that nothing was working. They looked at law and order and said, I don't see justice. They looked at the economy and said, I don't see growth. They looked at the education system and said, I see indoctrination. They looked at migration and said that there's no controls. And so they took it out on the European parliamentary elections and went for an alternative or for something different. And that really what we need in order to start winning back and taking back control, to coin a phrase, is what Pierre Poilievre in Canada has described as common sense conservatism. This idea of getting the very basic things right at home first before starting to talk about more high and mighty things. So is that where we're going to head after this, or do you think it's going to get worse?
Well, I mean, I'll take the, I'll let the other ladies follow me. And that is what you've just described, and I think more or less what Anne-Elisabeth was saying, is like that old joke, isn't it, about two ladies in the restaurant. And one says, this food is terrible. And the other lady says, yes, and the portions are so small. And that's what that's what the situation is in French politics, as you describe it. And it's not much better in most places and in Europe, and I think that we are, but I am optimistic for the reasons I've given, which is to say that, if you keep trying to maintain a cordon sanitaire against parties which get more and more votes, you eventually reach the situation of the German left, which is essentially saying it looks as though these people are going to be able to break out of the cordon sanitaire, so let's make them illegal. And I don't think that's a practical method for running a democracy in the modern world. It's obviously a mixture of fraud and authoritarianism. And that's something which is not ever going to be, if it's publicly avowed, win votes. So my own feeling is we are moving to a situation in which, I don't like the phrase cordon sanitaire, but in which the parties which have been excluded so far will have to be invited into the system. That may mean, and I think in the case of AFD it does mean, a split in the AFD. There are some parties which have got people in them you don't want. And and if the deal is offered in a way that enables the other people to enter government and gets a share of power, then I think that is something we should probably be happy to get. I mean, I am optimistic that that will happen, because the current system of government, I was quoting Pierre Manon's theory before you arrived, the current system of government is one in which the centre is claiming to be the permanent majority when it is in fact on the verge of becoming a minority, and I think that is good for us, although at the moment not very appetizing.
Well, I suppose maybe I can add to John's joke by saying, at this point, if you're a voter, you're also saying, well, wait, actually, this isn't even what I ordered, and now I have to pay the bill for it, and it's twice as much as the menu said. I mean, I think that's what voters are going to feel like, and although I fully recognize the pragmatic, sort of realistic idea that these parties that have been corralled into the sick room, right, the plague-ridden parties, that they'll have to split themselves up so that they're honored with an invitation to join the room that they're perfectly entitled to be in, seems to me is not going to, it's not going to help the moderates' case at all, because voters are going to see through it, and they're going to say, well, just because, if you give me a double portion of a thing I didn't order, it doesn't mean I should have to eat it or to pay for it or to pay double for it. So, I mean, I think that yes, it would be good if parties who were democratically elected were actually allowed to be in the room to participate in the process. But I'm not sure that that's what the voters signed up for. I think they want something more than making sure their most palatable people are allowed to be in the room. I'm not sure that's democracy.
Final word?
I would be a bit more I'd hedge my bets a bit more, because one of the things that seemed to me obvious is that you can offer a conservative and a radical right solution, several solutions, and it takes something more for the voters to take the step, the final step that gets the government in power, and I'm thinking of Italy. And it's very obvious that Giorgia Meloni is another type of conservative leader, and she probably is the example to follow, because there are fewer people than perhaps some among you think who want to go it alone without Europe, the European Union in Europe. And that's a fact. You may want to reform the European Union. My point of view of Brexit is I understood my Brexiteer friends in Britain perfectly. I understood the issues of sovereignty. But I said, you're not quite a founding country, but we're one of the really big beasts in Europe. And do like the French, don't apply what you don't like, but, fight to change it from the inside. It's a hard fight. Right now, Thierry Breton is paying the price. But the French commissioner, who was nixed by Ursula von der Leyen and whom Macron could not defend or would not defend. But by and large, I think good politics is also, we take we keep a few principles that we feel are, those lines that cannot be crossed, and otherwise it has to be the art of the possible. And we don't always have those politicians, and when we have them, they win. And that's really mostly, Meloni is a really shining example because she has remained adamant on sort of key ideas. She's now inspiring other European countries, including the Labour government of Great Britain, on immigration. Since I understand that after saying that the Rwanda plan of the Tories was a horrible thing that was could not even be considered, they're interested in doing exactly the same thing but in Albania. So also because immigration is really biting them in the poll numbers, which is the only place where it hurts. So I also think that conservatives should try and think not only about those ideas that we share, but also what is there that the can bring people who have been prejudiced against us, and also feel is really something that they don't want to give up. And how do we bring them on without losing our soul? And I think that's the most important thing.
But can I just make the? Well, I'm wired up. Can we just make? I'm glad you've introduced actual policies as well as politics, because what the National Conservatives, for example, want to bring into the wider conservative movement are things which, 20 or 30 years ago would not have been considered at all unusual. And we do not, there is no appetite, it seems to me, for leaving the European Union outside of England, outside of Britain. I doubt if anyone, there's no practical politics of that in Ireland, I think, or most of the countries represented, or in the ECR. What are the policies that we wish to bring in? Well, I think a defense of national sovereignty. I think a family policy. I think an attempt to protect and enhance national culture and give it a priority rather than treating any country as being simply an arena in which multiculturalism kind of plays out its games. And there are, and of course, a lower rate of immigration. So all of those things seem to me things which most conservative parties, most mainstream parties used to believe in, and it's only in recent years that they've become anti-conservative or marks of extremism, and so I think that's and of course you weren't here, but one of the things we're talking about is reuniting the right, because it's divided now. But those divisions have to be overcome, or else we face a very long, cold left-wing winter.
Well, with that, I think we'll finish there. So I'd like to thank the panel for their excellent contributions.